The auction block smelled like rot and rain. Helena Carrington stood on it anyway, chains loose around wrists too big for the manacles the guards usually used. She was 7 feet of muscle and scar tissue, shoulders built for hauling stone, not standing still while strangers stared. "Any bids?" the auctioneer called, voice cracking with doubt. Silence. Someone in the crowd laughed. "Send her back to the mines." Even the mines didn't want her. "She broke a man's arm," another voice muttered, "just by grabbing him wrong. She doesn't even talk right. Something's wrong with her head." Helena kept her eyes on the mud. She'd learned that looking up only made it worse. Looking up meant they saw your face, and your face meant they remembered you, and being remembered was the same as being hated. An old woman spat near her feet. Ugly, useless thing. Should have died with the rest of her family in that fire. Helena's jaw tightened. That was the only reaction she allowed herself. The auctioneer wiped his brow. "Do I hear anything? 1 coin? Half a coin?" Nothing. He was about to wave her off the block, back to whatever gutter had produced her, when a voice cut through the crowd. Flat. Bored. "Final. 2 coins. The crowd turned as one. Duke Dominic Valemont stood near the back, still in his riding coat, mud on his boots like he'd come straight from somewhere else, and hadn't meant to stop here at all. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't performing kindness for an audience. He looked, if anything, faintly irritated with himself. "My lord," the auctioneer stammered. "Surely you don't mean 2 coins," Dominic repeated. "Do you want them or not?" Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Someone laughed under their breath. The Duke's finally lost his mind. What's he going to do with a thing like that? Maybe he needs a new ox. Helena heard every word. She always did. The coins changed hands. The chains came off her wrists and were looped instead around a rope, handed to a manservant like she was livestock being led home. She didn't cry. She'd stopped crying a long time ago. Crying only made people angrier. She simply followed, head down, boots sinking in the mud behind a stranger's carriage, waiting for the moment this decision would be reversed. Because it always was. Someone always changed their mind about her eventually. Behind her, she heard the auctioneer mutter to his assistant, 2 coins for the biggest mistake he'll ever make. Helena didn't disagree. She just kept walking, because that was the only thing left to do. The carriage ride back to Valemont Hall was silent. Dominic sat across from nothing. He hadn't let her inside. Not yet. Helena walked behind, rope loose in the manservant's hand, boots dragging with every step. Nobody spoke to her. Nobody spoke to him either, though the coachman kept glancing back, like he expected the Duke to change his mind and leave her at the crossroads. He didn't. By the time they reached the gates, the sun was setting behind the estate's black iron fence, and half the household staff had gathered to see what their master had dragged home this time. "My lord," the steward said carefully, "is that a person?" "Obviously. Forgive me, but why?" "I don't know," Dominic said. It was the truth, and it unsettled him more than he let show. He'd gone to the auction to buy horses. He'd left with a woman twice the size of any man in his household, and he could not, for the life of him, explain why. He'd seen the way the crowd looked at her. He recognized that look. He'd worn it himself once, a long time ago, when his father used to parade him in front of dinner guests and call him the disappointment. Too tall, too awkward, too much of everything nobody wanted in an heir. Nobody had bought him out of that. He'd had to survive it alone. Maybe that was why. Maybe it was nothing at all. "Feed her," he said. "Find her a room. Not the stables. An actual room." The steward blinked. "My lord, the servants' quarters are—" "An actual room," Dominic repeated, already walking away. Helena stood at the gate, unmoving, waiting for someone to correct this mistake. She was used to being purchased and then immediately regretted, sold to a workhouse that didn't want her a week later, passed to a farmer who decided she ate too much. Every arrangement ended the same way, someone realizing what she was and getting rid of her. She expected this to be no different. "Well?" the steward said, exasperated. "Come inside then, since apparently that's what he wants." She hesitated at the threshold. Warm light spilled out from inside the manor. Candles, a fire, the smell of bread. Things she hadn't been near in years. She half expected the door to slam the moment she stepped through it. It didn't. Later that night, Dominic stood at his study window, glass of brandy untouched in his hand, watching the darkened courtyard. His cousin Edmund had already heard the news. Word travelled fast, in a house full of servants, and came barging in without knocking. 2 coins, Edmund said, incredulous. For a giant. Dominic, what in God's name were you thinking? I wasn't. That much is obvious. What are you going to do with her? Dominic didn't answer right away. He thought of the way she hadn't looked up once during the entire ride home. Not from fear of him, he suspected. From certainty. Certainty that whatever kindness she'd just been shown would be withdrawn the moment it became inconvenient. He knew that certainty. He'd carried it himself for years. I don't know yet, he admitted, but I couldn't leave her there. Edmund studied him a long moment, then shook his head and poured himself a drink too. You're going to regret this. Probably, Dominic said quietly, but even as he said it, something in his chest, something he hadn't felt in a long while, refused to agree. Helena woke before dawn, out of habit. She'd slept on the floor beside the bed, not on it. The mattress looked too soft, too clean, the kind of thing that got ruined by someone like her, and then she'd be blamed for ruining it. The floor was safer. The floor didn't judge. She folded the blanket they'd given her with careful, precise corners, the way she'd learned to fold things at the workhouse. Wrong corners meant a beating. Old habits didn't leave just because the room had changed. When a maid knocked and found her already dressed, kneeling by the door instead of sitting, the girl nearly dropped her tray. You're up early. I didn't want to be late, Helena said. Her voice was low, careful, like she measured every word before spending it. For work. What work is there? Work. The maid looked confused. It's breakfast. You're meant to eat. Helena stared at the tray, like it might be a trick. Am I allowed? The question hit the maid harder than she expected. She didn't have an answer, so she just set the tray down and hurried off to tell the kitchen staff. By midday, the whole household had a story to tell. She'd stood outside the dining room for 10 minutes before anyone noticed her, waiting for permission to enter. She'd eaten standing at the sideboard rather than sit at the table, because sitting felt like claiming a place that wasn't hers. When the cook offered her a second helping, she'd flinched, certain it was a test she was about to fail. Dominic heard about all of it by the time he came down from his study. He found her in the courtyard, sweeping stones that didn't need sweeping, because idle hands, in her experience, invited punishment faster than busy ones. You don't need to do that, he said. She stopped immediately, broom lowered, eyes down. I'm sorry. I'll stop. That's not what he exhaled. You don't need to earn your meals here, or your room, or anything. Helena said nothing. She'd heard versions of that sentence before, from other households, right before the arrangement fell apart. I mean it, Dominic said, though he wasn't entirely sure why he was working so hard to convince her. That evening, he passed her door and found it open a crack. She was on the floor again, blanket folded beneath her like a mat, sleeping upright against the wall instead of lying down. He didn't wake her. He just stood there a moment, arms crossed, feeling something he didn't have a name for. The next morning, he had a bed frame reinforced, wider, sturdier, built for her size, and placed a chair for her at the family table without a word of explanation. When she came down and saw it, she stood frozen in the doorway. That's for me? Unless you'd prefer the floor, Dominic said dryly, already seating himself. She sat, slowly, like the chair might collapse or vanish beneath her. It didn't. She ate that morning, with her eyes still down, still braced for the moment someone would tell her she didn't belong there. Nobody did. It was such a small thing, a chair, a bed, a place at a table. But for Helena, it was the first crack in a wall she'd spent her whole life building. She didn't trust it yet, but she noticed it. Weeks passed before Helena stopped flinching at kindness. It happened in small doses. Dominic never announced his intentions. He simply acted and let her decide what to make of it. The first was clothes. Her old dress had been patched so many times it barely held together, sized for a woman half her frame. One morning a seamstress arrived with fabric enough for 3 dresses, all cut to Helena's actual measurements, no apology attached to the size. "I didn't ask for this," Helena said, standing stiff while the seamstress worked around her. "I know," Dominic said, passing through the hall. "You didn't have to." She wore the first dress, like it belonged to someone else, waiting for someone to demand it back. Nobody did. Then came the room, not just a bed and 4 walls, an actual room, repainted, with a window that let in real light, and shelves built tall enough that she didn't have to stoop to reach them. Small things. Things built for someone her size, as if her size were simply a fact, and not a flaw to be managed around. "Why does it matter what height the shelves are?" she asked once, genuinely puzzled. "Because you live here," Dominic said, like it was obvious. "Might as well not spend your life ducking." Nobody had ever built anything to fit her before. She'd spent her whole life folding herself smaller to fit spaces made for everyone else. Then, one evening at dinner, he did something that undid her more than any of it. "What do you think?" he asked, gesturing at the estate ledger open beside his plate. "The tenant families are asking for more grain storage before winter. Worth the cost?" Helena blinked. "You're asking me? You grew up working land, didn't you? Better instincts than half my stewards." She hesitated, unused to her opinion being wanted rather than tolerated. Slowly, carefully, she answered, and he listened. Really listened, adjusting the plan based on what she said. Nobody had asked her opinion on anything in 15 years. The birthday came without warning. She hadn't mentioned the date to anyone. Hadn't thought anyone would care to ask. But Dominic had gone through the auction house's intake records, the only place her birth date had ever been written down, filed alongside her sale price, like she was livestock. That evening, there was a small cake at her place at the table. Nothing extravagant, just enough to say, "I noticed you. I remembered you." Helena stared at it for a long moment, throat tight. "Nobody's done this before," she said quietly. Then it was past time someone did. She didn't cry. She'd trained herself out of crying years ago. But something in her chest loosened that night. Some old, tired muscle she hadn't known was still clenched. Lying on her bed that night, the bed, not the floor, for the first time since she'd arrived, she stared at the ceiling and let herself think the thought she'd been refusing to think for weeks. This is what family feels like. She didn't trust it completely. Not yet. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, she wanted to. Valemont Hall had been quiet for years. Dominic had inherited a house full of empty rooms and a staff who moved through their duties like ghosts. Efficient, silent, careful never to disturb a master who ate alone and rarely smiled. It hadn't always been that way, but nobody remembered exactly when the life had gone out of the place. It simply had. Helena didn't decide to change any of it. She just couldn't help herself. It started in the kitchen. She wandered down one morning, restless, unused to idleness, and found the cook struggling to lift a cauldron too heavy for her frame. "Let me," Helena said, and lifted it like it weighed nothing. The cook laughed, surprised, delighted. "Well, aren't you useful to have around?" Nobody had called her useful in that tone before. Usually, it came edged with resentment. This time, it came with a smile. She stayed in the kitchen longer than she meant to, peeling vegetables, listening to the staff gossip, occasionally offering a dry comment that made the younger maids burst out laughing. Within a week, the kitchen had a warmth to it that hadn't existed before. Word spread, and other staff started finding excuses to pass through. Then came the gardens. She noticed the roses were dying, untended, and without asking anyone's permission, she started clearing weeds in the early mornings before her other duties. The old groundskeeper, half blind and long past effective work, was thrilled for the company and taught her what he knew. By the second month, the gardens were blooming again for the first time in years. The children of the tenant families noticed too. Helena's size, which had made grown men flinch, fascinated them instead. They climbed on her like she was furniture, shrieking with laughter as she lifted them onto her shoulders. Where servants once shushed noisy children away from the manor, now laughter echoed through the courtyard on Sunday afternoons, and nobody stopped it. Dominic noticed all of it, piece by piece, though he said little. He noticed the staff smiling more. He noticed meals in the servants' hall running late because nobody wanted to leave the table. He noticed, one evening, that he was eating alone in the formal dining room, while the actual warmth of the house had migrated to the kitchen without him. So he did something he hadn't done in a decade. He picked up his own plate and walked to the kitchen. The room went silent when he appeared in the doorway. Cook and maid straightening immediately, bracing for reprimand. "Don't stop on my account," he said, and took a seat at the long wooden table beside Helena, who stared at him like he'd lost his mind. "You're eating here?" she asked. "Apparently this is where the food's actually good," he said. "And the company." Slowly, hesitantly, the staff relaxed. Conversation resumed. Laughter returned. For the first time since his father's death, Dominic Vaillamont ate a meal surrounded by people, not isolated behind mahogany and silver. He caught Helena watching him, an unreadable expression on her face. "What?" he asked. "Nothing," she said, but she was smiling, small, careful, like she wasn't sure she was allowed to. The mansion, brick by brick and laugh by laugh, was becoming something it hadn't been in a long, long time. A home. The letter arrived on a grey Tuesday, sealed with the crest of the Crown's registry office. Dominic read it twice before he understood what it meant. "They're saying she's property," he said, voice flat with disbelief. "That the auction sale was never legally finalized, that she belongs to someone else." Edmund, seated across the study, frowned. "Who?" "Lord Reginald Ashcombe." The name landed like a stone. Ashcombe, minor nobility, deep in debt, infamous for finding technicalities that lined his pockets. He'd apparently discovered that the workhouse which sold Helena had never held proper title over her in the first place, having taken her in as an orphaned child rather than purchased her outright. That made her, in the law's cold language, unclaimed property. And unclaimed property reverted to the nearest registered creditor of the institution that housed her. Ashcombe had settled that workhouse's debts 3 days ago. "He wants her back," Dominic said. "Or rather, he wants what she's worth. A curiosity, something to put on display, or auction off again to the highest bidder." Helena, listening from the doorway, felt the floor tilt beneath her. "He can do that?" she asked quietly. "Just take me?" "Not while I'm alive," Dominic said. But even as he said it, doubt crept in. The law was clear enough, and clearer still, when weighed against a man like Ashcombe, who had friends in the registry office and coin enough to grease every hesitant clerk. That night, Helena couldn't sleep. She sat by her window, the one built with her in mind, and stared out at the gardens she'd brought back to life. Of course it wouldn't last, she thought. It never lasts. She'd let herself believe, just a little, that this was permanent. The chair at the table, the birthday cake, the children on her shoulders. She should have known better than to trust it. Ashcombe arrived 4 days later, uninvited, trailed by 2 registry officials and a smirk he didn't bother hiding. "Quite the specimen you've kept hidden here, Vaillamont," he said, eyes crawling over Helena like she was livestock at market again. "Shame to think she's been living above her station this whole time. A proper display piece, don't you think? I know collectors who'd pay handsomely." "She is not a display piece," Dominic said, voice like ice. "The law disagrees." Ashcombe unrolled the documents with theatrical relish. "The workhouse never held valid title, which means the original sale to you was never valid either. She's mine, Vaillamont. Whether or not you've grown fond of your pet." The word landed like a slap. Helena's hands curled into fists at her sides. Dominic stepped between them before he even realized he'd moved. "Get off my land. You have 30 days to contest this in court," Ashcombe said, unbothered, already turning to leave. "Or hand her over. Either way, Vaillamont, she's coming with me eventually. Everyone has a price. even dukes. The carriage rolled away, and silence fell over the courtyard. Helena stood frozen, the old certainty crashing back over her, the one she'd almost let herself forget. Someone always changes their mind. Someone always finds a way to take it back. Dominic turned to her, jaw tight with fury he was struggling to control. "I am not losing you to that man," he said. "Whatever it takes." Helena searched his face for a lie. She didn't find one, but 30 days suddenly felt like nothing at all. Dominic spent the next 3 weeks in courtrooms and correspondence, chasing every legal thread that might save her. His solicitor was blunt. "Ashcombe's claim is thin, but thin doesn't mean weak. He has friends in the registry, judges who owe him favors. This could take months to fight properly, and you don't have months. Then find another way." There was one. His solicitor mentioned it reluctantly, a formal declaration of guardianship, filed and witnessed before the court, naming Helena as a ward of the Valemont household. It would strip Ashcombe's claim of any legal ground, but it required a public hearing, a public statement, no hiding behind paperwork. "Everyone will know," his solicitor warned. "The whole county will hear you stand up and say it." "Good," Dominic said. "Let them." The hearing was held in the county courthouse, packed with nobility who'd come for gossip more than justice. Ashcombe sat smug in the front row, certain the Duke wouldn't humiliate himself over a servant girl in front of his peers. Helena stood at the back, half convinced she should simply leave before this cost Dominic more than she was worth. She'd caused nothing but trouble since the day he bought her. Maybe it would be easier. "Helena Carrington," the magistrate called. She stepped forward, spine straight despite the eyes crawling over her. Dominic rose before the magistrate could continue. "Before this goes further," he said, voice carrying through the silent courtroom, "I want it stated plainly, for the record, so there's no confusion about what's being decided here." Ashcombe smirked. "Get on with it, Valemont." Dominic looked past him, straight at Helena. "She is my family." The courtroom stirred. Ashcombe's smirk faltered. "Not my servant," Dominic continued. "Not property to be bought, sold, or auctioned to whichever collector offers the highest price. She has a place in my household that no document gave her, and no document can take away. I am filing for guardianship not because the law requires proof of ownership, but because I refuse to let this court pretend for one more minute that family is something you can price." Murmurs swept the room. Ashcombe rose, red-faced. "This is absurd. She's not your blood, Valemont. Neither is a wife," Dominic said flatly. "Neither is an adopted son. Family was never only about blood, and you know it. It's about who stays." The magistrate, visibly moved despite himself, called for the guardianship papers. Helena stood frozen at the front of the courtroom, tears she'd trained herself out of years ago, threatening to break through anyway. Nobody had ever said those words about her in public. Nobody had ever risked anything to keep her. Ashcombe protested, blustered, threatened appeals, but the room had already turned against him. Nobility who'd come for gossip left whispering something else entirely. The Duke stood up in open court and called her family. The papers were signed within the hour. Outside on the courthouse steps, Helena finally found her voice. "You didn't have to do that. Not in front of everyone." "Yes," Dominic said simply. "I did." For the first time since the auction block, Helena let herself believe, completely, without reservation, that she was not going anywhere. Ashcombe didn't disappear quietly. 2 weeks after the hearing, whispers began circulating through the county. Rumors that Dominic Valemont had falsified estate ledgers, skimmed funds from his tenant families, embezzled from a charitable trust his late father had established. Serious accusations, the kind that ended in stripped titles and seized land. Dominic was baffled. "None of this is true." "Doesn't matter if it's true," his solicitor said grimly. "It matters if enough lords believe it before the Crown's investigators arrive." Helena recognized the pattern immediately. Ashcombe couldn't win her back through the courts, so he'd found another way to hurt Dominic. destroy the reputation that made him untouchable in the first place. "He's doing this because of me," she said. "He's doing this because he's a coward," Dominic corrected. "Don't take on his cruelty as your fault." But Helena wasn't finished. She remembered something. A name, mentioned once by the smug registry clerk who'd first delivered Ashcombe's claim, back when nobody thought she was listening closely enough to matter. People rarely thought that. It made her an excellent listener. She went to the kitchen staff, the stable hands, the tenant families whose grain stores Dominic had personally overseen. People the investigators would never think to interview, because nobody interviewed servants. But servants heard everything. Within 3 days, she'd gathered what the investigators hadn't. A maid who'd once worked in Ashcombe's household and left after witnessing him forge signatures on debt transfers. A clerk who'd been paid to alter workhouse records, the very same records used to challenge Helena's original sale. "He didn't just want me," Helena said, laying it all before Dominic. "He needed the money from selling me. He's been forging documents for years to stay ahead of his debts. The claim on me wasn't really about me at all. It was about what I was worth to him." Dominic stared at the evidence, then at her. "You found all this yourself. Nobody thinks to hide things from someone they've already decided is invisible. They brought it before the Crown's investigators together. The forged debt transfers unraveled Ashcombe's entire scheme, not just the false claim on Helena, but years of fraud against half a dozen estates. He was arrested within the week, his own greed finally catching up to him. The rumors against Dominic dissolved as quickly as they'd spread, replaced by a different story entirely. The Duke, who'd nearly lost everything, saved by the very woman his enemy tried to take from him. That evening, Dominic found her in the garden she'd brought back to life, hands still faintly stained with soil. "You didn't have to do any of that," he said. "You could have let the investigators handle it. You didn't have to stand up in that courtroom either," Helena said. "But you did it for me. I wasn't about to do less for you." He studied her for a long moment. Not the girl the auction crowd had mocked, not the servant expected to fold herself smaller to survive. Just Helena, steady, fierce, entirely his family, in every way that mattered. "2 coins, he said quietly, shaking his head. "I still can't believe what they nearly threw away." "Their mistake," Helena said, almost smiling. "Your fortune." Ashcombe's trial drew half the county to the courthouse steps. The man who'd once called Helena a specimen and a display piece now sat in the dock, stripped of the smug confidence that had carried him through every previous scheme. The evidence Helena had gathered, testimonies from a maid, a clerk, tenant families with nothing left to fear, laid out years of fraud in plain, damning detail. The forged debt transfers, the falsified workhouse records, the years of quietly bleeding smaller estates dry, while presenting himself as respectable nobility. "You built your entire fortune on paper lies," the magistrate said, "and very nearly destroyed an honest man's reputation to cover your debts." Ashcombe had no defense left. His titles were stripped, his remaining assets seized to repay the families he'd defrauded. He was led from the courthouse in chains, the same chains, Helena noted without pleasure, that she herself had once worn. She felt no satisfaction watching him go. Only a quiet settling, like a wound finally closing. Outside, the crowd that had once whispered about the Duke's giant now spoke of her differently. "She's the one who caught him," someone murmured. "Found the evidence herself. Sharp as anyone in that registry office, and twice as loyal." Imagine. Everyone thought she was worth 2 coins. The same people who'd sneered at the auction now watched her with something closer to respect, even a little shame at how quickly they judged her worthless. Nobody apologized outright. People rarely did, but the change in how they looked at her was its own quiet justice. Word of it reached the tenant families first, then the servants, then the wider county. The story spread not as gossip about a curiosity the Duke had purchased, but as something else entirely. A woman who'd been thrown away by everyone who ever knew her, who'd found a family willing to fight for her, and who'd fought back twice as hard to protect it. The workhouse that had first sold her, the one that treated her as unclaimed property to be traded off to whoever paid, closed within the month, its remaining debts exposed alongside Ashcombe's, its cruelty finally catching up with it too. Helena stood at the courthouse steps long after the crowd dispersed, Dominic beside her. "Do you feel better?" he asked. Seeing him held accountable, she considered the question honestly. "I feel like the people who called me worthless were wrong, not because of what I did today, because of what I already was, the whole time. I just needed someone to see it." "I saw it," Dominic said, "the very first day. You saw a giant nobody wanted to buy. I saw someone worth buying," he corrected. "Everyone else was just too blind to notice." She let herself smile at that, fully, without bracing for it to be taken back. The mines that once rejected her, the workhouse that sold her, the crowd that laughed at her price, all of them had been wrong about what she was worth. It had taken one man's impossible choice on a muddy auction block to prove it. Justice, Helena realized, wasn't only what happened to Ashcombe in that courtroom. It was every ordinary day since, where she was no longer the girl no one wanted. 10 years later, Valemont Hall was unrecognizable to anyone who remembered it before. The silent halls of Dominic's inheritance had long since filled with noise, children's laughter echoing off walls that once knew only the click of a lonely man's footsteps. Tenant families gathered in the courtyard most Sundays, drawn by celebrations that had become tradition without anyone quite deciding to start them. The gardens Helena had once tended alone now bloomed under the care of a dozen hands she'd trained herself. The mansion breathed. It lived. Helena stood at the edge of the courtyard that particular autumn afternoon, watching 3 children chase each other around the fountain, 2 of them tenant farmers' grandchildren, one of them a girl the household had taken in the year before, small and frightened, and convinced nobody would want her either. Helena had recognized that look instantly. She always would. The girl had stopped flinching at kindness only last month. Helena remembered exactly how that felt. "She reminds me of someone," Dominic said, coming to stand beside her. He was grayer now, slower in the mornings, but his eyes hadn't changed. Still steady, still watching Helena the way he had since the day he decided 2 coins was a fair price for the family he hadn't known he was missing. "She'll be all right," Helena said. "Give her time." "You gave everyone time," Dominic said. "That's rather your gift." Servants passed through the courtyard calling greetings, no longer moving like ghosts through a house that feared its own master. The cook, grey-haired now herself, still ruled the kitchen, where Helena had once lifted cauldrons too heavy for anyone else. The old groundskeeper had passed years back, but the roses he'd taught Helena to tend still bloomed every spring, tended now by the girl who reminded her so much of herself. A young man approached, one of the stable hands, hat in hand. "My lord, my lady, the village elders are asking whether the harvest festival might be held here again, this year, same as always." "Same as always," Dominic confirmed, and the young man beamed, hurrying off to spread the news. Helena watched him go, something settling warm and permanent in her chest. "Was it worth it?" she asked, suddenly, echoing a question she'd heard a stranger mutter once, years ago, at the edge of that very courtyard. Paying 2 coins for someone nobody wanted. Dominic considered the question with the same seriousness he gave every decision that mattered. "It was the greatest fortune I ever received," he said. No grand confession, no romance dressed up as destiny, just quiet, steady truth, spoken the way he'd spoken it in that courtroom years before, plainly, without apology, because it had always simply been fact. The children's laughter rang out across the courtyard as the sun dipped low behind the hall that had once stood silent and cold. Villagers gathered near the gates for the evening's small celebration, servants setting out tables like they'd done every year since the estate remembered how to celebrate anything at all. Helena Carrington, once the girl no one wanted, sold for 2 coins on a rainy auction block, certain every kindness would eventually be withdrawn, stood now at the heart of a household that had never once made her prove she belonged. She didn't need to prove it anymore. She simply was home. The end, fand. Thank you for watching. If this story reminded you that family isn't always about blood, it's about who chooses to stay, please hit the like button and subscribe so you never miss the next one. Duke Tales by Mia brings you a new story every week. Drop a comment. What part of Helena's journey hit you the hardest?